Director General of the COAI. Telecom is an essential service, an important service. Many of us are relying on telecom and our access to the internet and to each other for keeping our sanity while in lockdown. So we wanted to understand the role of the telecom industry in this crisis, but also talk to Mr. Mathews about various other aspects of the telecom industry. Welcome and thanks for joining us, Rajan.
Thanks, Nikhil. Thanks, Arun. Real privilege to be part of this discussion with MediaNama. We've always, tried to see you guys are the big thinkers in this area, and we've always appreciated the insights that you folks bring to the table. So glad to participate.
Thanks, Rajan. So I'll jump straight to it, Rajan. We wanted to understand what are the challenges the telecom industry is facing from an operational perspective right now in keeping the networks up, the services up. Do you have any numbers for us? What's the growth in internet usage that you're seeing? What's it like right now?
So we've seen the original traffic increase about a couple of days after the Honorable PM announced the quarantine. We saw traffic jump up almost by 30%. And then it spiked and then sort of came down to a manageable 15%, 12 to 15% on the network. And so we were seeing something like 6,900 petabytes of data flowing through the network, which again puts us at a pretty high rate of consumption, right? And again, what we also noticed subsequently to this, that when we analyzed the data, the usage was shifting very heavily to streaming video type services, YouTube, Zoom, very heavy video content, obviously to be expected given the fact that people are working from home. So the significant issue that was addressed was how do we control the streaming video? And that's one of the things we worked with the DOT on, saying is that we reduce the HD transmission content to SD. And that surprisingly did a lot to bring down the load factor on the network. Nikhil, what was very helpful when working with the DOT, we had something like 900 BTSs, which are the base stations, the electronics sitting at the bottom of a tower, 900 of them that were offline because of various issues with local municipalities, vis-a-vis fees, payments. As a result of the request we made, we were able to get that down to 70. So you can imagine what 8 to 900 BTSs coming online does to being able to deal with the additional consumption load factor on our networks. The other thing that was also very helpful in terms of dealing with this and what has helped stabilize somewhat the usage and the uptime of our networks is the fact that fiber cuts got reduced substantially. We used to experience something like 100 fiber cuts a day. And that got reduced to about 7 a day. All right, again, because road construction stopped, all construction stopped. And because of that, we could bring online a lot more of the fiber that you would have to keep in redundancy or so. So the combination of these facts, right, dealing with our folks who agreed to go from HD to SD, and I must say that people like Amazon and YouTube and Hulu and all of these folks really stepped up to the plate and helped. So that was one, bringing on these additional BTSs and again, reducing the fiber cuts, getting that online. The combination of those factors was really a big help in today, pretty much stabilizing the network in terms of 99.99 upside. We've seen some derogation, some reduction in speeds, but that's only to be expected because of the intensity of usage in certain locations.
So across the operators that are part of the COAI, are you also seeing any impact on revenue? Are people upgrading their accounts since many of us are working from home? And is there a positive outcome expected out of the situation for the telecom industry?
So I think what we are expecting to see, I think there was a minimal impact on the first or the last quarter of the last year because we had about 15 days in the month of March. So I think the big impact that we'll see is on the first quarter of this year, beginning April. And I think we would expect to see somewhere by about 12, maybe 10% increase in tariffs in terms of not the fact that we're increasing the tariffs, but because tariffs were increased previously, some benefit of that and the volumes now increasing, right? The combination of the volume increase. So Previously, we would have probably seen voice consumption somewhere in the 600-700 minutes per user range. That is going up closer to the 800 per user range per month. Data consumption going up from, say, somewhere between 9 and 10 gigabits, now trending towards 11 and 12 gigabits of consumption. So the combination of those factors clearly will have a positive impact on the revenue stream of operators. We expect that.
Okay, so from an infrastructure perspective, what are the demands that you may have right now from the government? What are some of the things that you think will help your operations right now?
So one thing that has become painfully clear, Nikhil, is the fact that when we had this big movement from our commercial areas to more of the residential areas, our cell towers, right, that we've been asking for, the paucity of those began to be a constraint, right? People were always complaining that, look, we don't want our cell towers in our backyard, either because of fears or aesthetics or whatever. And so we used to have problems with the RWAs. And I think it's becoming critically clear that when you have only one network to really speak of, other countries have 4 and 5 networks, we have just one, and it's the mobility network. So cell towers become a critical component in terms of being able to provide the capacity and the coverage. And so I think one of the learnings in this is that, look, if we want to have that, then we've got to have the commensurate opening up of right of way in terms of putting our cell towers in there. The second thing that we also found out is that if you want to have sort of a dynamic aspect to being able to deal with demand, you've got to have fiber. Fiber is only one of the components of our networks that has some ability to dynamically respond to increases in bandwidth usage. And we found that only about 25% of our cell towers were connected through fiber. And again, this is a right-of-way issue. This is the problem where municipalities were asking for exorbitant amounts of money for getting permissions and laying the fiber and for renting space. So that is another clear issue that has come up. The other thing that has come to the fore is that when we have these dynamic situations, we rely on our networks for backhaul, what we call middle backhaul and long distance backhaul for microwave spots, right? When we can't get fiber, then we default to microwave spots. And for the last 4 years, we have not been getting any increase in microwave spots for backhaul. We've been asking for E-band and V-band, and again, that has not happened. So again, these are the things that have come to the fore in terms of saying, although we are sufficient and we are kind of holding on right now, these are things that we have to address going forward in terms of sustainability of our infrastructure.
Okay. Arun, you had some questions?
Yes, sir. So specifically with regard to the infrastructure, what have been the bigger costs that you have been seeing? Has it been, since I'm guessing that building new towers is not on the cards for the moment, but how about the electricity that's going to existing towers, the diesel supply there? Bharti Infratel spoke of adding small cells at existing tower infrastructure. What are the biggest expenses you're seeing in that part of the supply chain that is kind of significant?
So the two components, clearly power consumption, because we need 24/7 power, that is one. And many of our cell towers have to have diesel generated backup power. And those tend to be some of the big constraints. Also, around what we are doing is more and more of our cell towers are moving to battery as an intermediate source. So obviously it's a storage device. And increasingly what we do when we configure our networks is the first point of power is the one generated from the grid. Then we go to about 4 hours or so of backup battery. And then if that fails, then we kick in the generator. So it's a 3-part type of a structure. So the biggest expenses is the maintenance of these cell towers. We have over 550,000 of them, and some of them in very inhospitable areas of the country. So when this particular situation was going on and we had problems in terms of transportation, we had people literally lugging diesel on their backs and walking for kilometers at a time to be able to get diesel into these cell towers. And that is clearly one of the big expense items. As I said, power is a big item, maintenance, smart hands, make sure that these folks are available. When fiber is cut, getting the fiber spliced back again and getting it back into operation. These tend to be major areas of expenses that we incur during these times.
So, in that sense, have you seen any positive impact of the reduction in oil prices?
Unfortunately, what happens is that at the retail level, we don't see that being passed on, right? That margin of difference between the wholesale price of oil and
Mhm.
the retail price, government tends to benefit as the passed on to the retail end. So diesel continues to be a significant part of the expenses that are incurred by operators for running our networks.
So we've also seen a couple of instances, at least that have come to our knowledge, but there seem to be many more of people working for the telecom industry with adequate passes getting beaten up by the police in various parts of the country. Are you seeing that still happen? And what is the kind of work that's required to ensure that that doesn't happen?
Thank you. A week post the quarantine period, when the instructions were not getting down to the local level, there were several instances where our folks were beaten up, and they suffered some injury, and they were being apprehended, and they were not allowed to move. And so what we did very quickly was create a list of all of the areas, that is by geography as well as in the spots that we required this, and brought it to the attention of the DOT. And I must say, Nikhil and Arun, at this particular period in time, one of the big things that have really helped is the support that we got from the DOT and the local term cell. So we immediately brought that to the attention of the DOT secretary. He immediately made sure that the operational folks in the locations, which are the term cells, they have, in a sense, a war room. It was immediately communicated with those complaints. They got in touch with the local legal enforcement, the police, and were able to get this sorted out, passes given to the key people, movement allowed, movement of equipment, movement of some vehicular traffic to be able to support activity from warehouses. That really solved the problem. So I think we had issues for the first week and a half or so, but very, very quickly, because of the apt intervention of the DOT with the local term cells, really helped resolve that problem. Now, we really don't face issues of any major component in this area.
Okay, sir. So on network traffic, I just wanted to see if you could give me some color on what kind of trends we are seeing, because Reliance Jio, in their results for this quarter, they said that it had gone from the quarter ending December 2019, it was 1,250 crore gigabytes of traffic. And in the quarter that just ended, the March 31st quarter, that number barely increased by 4 crore terabytes. So it went from 1,250 to 1,254 crore terabytes. Sorry, crore gigabytes. So I was just wondering what the increase across operators has been, and if it has been indeed as high as 30-20%, where the discrepancy between operators is coming from.
So I think what we are seeing an average, and of course, the problem with averages, right? You can be impacted by extreme measures at either end. So what we've noticed on average, though, is about a 12 to 15% increase above normal. So as I said, we noticed that the total gigabits or the petabytes, I mean, we are measuring it in petabytes per day, or for the month, turned out to be 6,900 petabytes of information that was flowing through, right, our networks. And that was the increased 15%, 12 to 15% from previous. So again, when you try and reduce that to consumption per user, we saw that going, say, from somewhere between 9 to 10 on average per user in the previous quarter, now all of a sudden spiking up to close to 11 to 12 gigabits per consumer, right? And again, principally, most of it accounted for by streaming video, because obviously that's the primary usage factor that kicks in. when people are working from home. So yes, some increase in voice. But one of the things that also helped manage the traffic is that we saw a shift in traffic. So what we would have seen, for example, during the commuting hours, right? That kind of flattened out. So because there's no traffic, the big spikes that you would have seen in the morning, and then the big spikes you would have seen in the latter part of the day, 4:30 to say about 7:30, 8:30, that got flattened out. So then you saw more of an activity during the daytime, picking up at about 10, going to about 2:33 kind of 10, and then again picking up late evening as people got into entertainment type activity. So and then what also happened, if you recollect, bottom of the pyramid, we saw all these folks, millions of them, who obviously moved from urban areas to either semi-urban and ultimately to rural areas. So again, we saw a shift in the patterns of the usage, and the combination of those factors obviously also helps in terms of load managing the network.
And on that note, on the load managing note, I think it's been a couple months since streaming services started reducing HD bit rates. And so far, their steps have been extended twice. Once was until May 3rd, and now I think it's been extended again. At least that's what I'm noticing on some of the bit rates that I'm seeing. Do operators still require these suppressions of bit rates, or can you handle levels of traffic that are that can support higher bit rates right now?
In spots, yes. Obviously, the problem that we've had is that we don't see an equal spread of information or data consumption, right? You see it spiking in hotspots, right? That's invariably where the problems arise. So what we try to do is that since we have a hard time trying to manage data traffic just by way of hotspots, we try in major areas, right? We've still requested that the definition HD to SD continue for a period in time. But as and when we get more comfortable in terms of understanding the stability of the data, because in the initial stages, right, we didn't know once the quarantine began how much was going to be consumed, where and how. Obviously, one of the other major factors that has kicked in is that we've gone from usage in what we call the public part of the network, which is the outdoor part, to the indoor side of the network. Right, more people at home. So Wi-Fi has become a major, and that Wi-Fi helps, offset some of the traffic on the major networks, right? So at least the what we call the radio access part of the network. So that has also helped. But clearly, what has happened is that when you shift to indoor coverage and you're depending upon routers, right? That the number of users on a router reduces the speeds for everybody on that router. So some of that experience has seeped in. And that's the other thing that is probably going to be a major takeaway as we move forward. We've got to enhance what we call the landline infrastructure, right? Fixed to home type experience, wiring up our homes, getting people used to meshed networks inside. These are things that we'll have to be looking at.
And I just wanted to, sorry, go on. No, go on, Nikhil.
So I wanted to just to ask a little bit about 5G, and Rajan, by when do you think the telecom industry is going to be able to afford a 5G auction? Because the government sure needs more money right now.
Nikhil, they're getting plenty of money from us, I assure you, right? So as it stands, 30 paisa of every rupee that we bring in on the top line goes back to the government with nothing really coming back to us. So that's obviously one of the things that we've been complaining about, saying is that we've got to leave more money in in the hands of our operators to be able to invest in our networks and the quality of services and the new technologies that you're talking about. Coming back to the 5G issue, Nicholas, the price point of the spectrum. This is 3 and 4 times, not just 3% or 10% or so. 3 and 4 times what is being paid for similar bandwidth and similar spectrum internationally. We've had several countries auction the 5G spectrum, and by comparison, we pay 4 or 5 times what those international rates are. But then look at what our ARPU is, which is the measure of our return on investment, right? The average person internationally pays $75. We get $3. dollars per customer. Even on a purchasing power parity, every once in a while I'll hear somebody from the TRAI.
I'm not necessarily going to buy that ARPU argument, Rajan, because I remember back in 2008, 2009, at that time, most operators were telling investors to not look at ARPU as a metric, but average revenue per minute as a metric and the number of minutes. So they were asking investors to look at overall revenue. And I guess now you can extend that same argument to average revenue per MB and amount of data consumed, given that this is a high user, low cost market. So I'm not sure whether ARPU is the right metric here.
So
Going by what the operators tell their own investors, by the way.
So, I mean, there are, when you look at from an investor, you have a point there, Nikhil. What we try and tell investors is, you can't have one metric that explains everything, right? So don't hang your hat on investment decisions on one factor. So clearly, ARPU is a bit of a math problem as well, right? If your subscribers increase, you'll have a fall in ARPU, right? Because the denominator is subscribers, and in a period of fast growth of subscribers, that new customer to kick in terms of a fast growth environment. Yes, there is that anomaly that creeps in, and then you have to use metrics. But if you're looking at more of a stable environment, there's not been a but it is a metric that we tend to look at, especially once you stabilize market share and stabilize subscribers and that type of thing. And again, we are saying is that it's not on a per minute usage, because obviously minutes saying we ought to be looking at revenue per gigabit of revenue, because data is basically the consumption unit. And so looking at that. So again, if you look at total revenue, right, and saying is that how much does the average consumer give me, all right, and I'm saying is that today it's at about 130, 140 rupees, right, however you want to disaggregate it by how much you spend on voice and how much is spent on data, throwing that sort of distinction and just looking at the absolute amount of how much on average a customer brings me, right, that's still a fairly decent metric to look at to compare operators to operators.
So, what kind of what kind of a upper ceiling do you think exists in terms of pricing right now for telecom operators in India? In the sense, how much do you think is there scope in terms of elasticity of price, in terms of elasticity of demand that that operators can afford? Because we saw over the last 6 to 8 months, many operators culling low ARPU, low revenue customers in order to shore up the metrics. And also increasing prices.
Yeah. So for one thing, Nikhil, we did a study when we looked at in a sense purchasing power. You looked at income per household per person, right? We started off by about 10 years ago or so, somewhere around there. Based on our GDP numbers, right? Average income per household was somewhere like $1,600 US dollars. It's now come to almost $2,000+ per person per head based on our GDP numbers, right? And during that period in time, when you look at absolute, in a sense, ability of somebody to afford services, right? Because it is on dollar basis, right? And if you look at that, you notice that almost 5, 6, 7 years ago, the average person was spending about 6% of their total revenue or their total income on telecom services. Today, it's gone to less than 1%. So there's been a big shift in consumer surplus, if you will, to the benefit of the consumer. So to answer your question, we think that yes, there is sufficient headroom because it's not profitable at the present point of view, for at least the incumbent operators who are there. Yes, it may be a little more profitable for Jio, but for the rest of them, that headroom is not sufficient to be able to continue to be able to pay the government and then still continue to invest. So
why exactly is that, Rajan? Why does Jio have more profitability more room for keeping prices low as opposed to others?
So I think two factors. Obviously, cost of capital may be very different to the two institutions, right?
Hmm.
Because one may have a better ability to incur debt at a lower price point, right, versus somebody else. So that is clearly one point. Cost of capital is very different. The resources available to the various entities are also the amount of debt that is carried by various entities. Obviously, the carrying cost of that is another factor in terms of if you can generate more from equity, right, rather than debt. Obviously, your unit costs come down. Obviously, you are using newer technology. You've got 4G, and also remember, Nicole, till 2014, incumbent operators had to sort of subscribe to 2G technology. You didn't have a choice. So if you
Hmm.
were given spectrum, right, up till 2014, when we quote unquote went to liberalize spectrum, and you were then asked to bid back for your spectrum, right? Until such time, you had no options but to use 2G technology. All right, and yes, 2010, 11, you had 3G technology come in, and yes, spectrum was available for 3G and 4G. So the point I'm making is that all of a sudden, when you have say 70, 80% of your subscribers on 2G, and now even if it has shrunk to 60%, you still have the cost of running that legacy network, which Geo does not have, right? Geo just runs one technology, which is 4G. So the cumulative benefit of all of that perhaps does give them a lower unit cost. Again, it all depends on how one does the math. Some of these are difficult numbers to come by in terms of what's really the comparable unit cost between all three operators, right? The closest it has come to is try doing that when it came to the interconnect usage charge, right? They try and do it on a sort of cost methodology. So again, I think there are some inbuilt benefits that come to newer operators. There's no question about it.
So I'm going to take a question from Nadeem Akhtar, who left a question for you, Rajan. He's asking about the fact that the FCC has de-licensed 6 gigahertz of the 6 gigahertz band, and Europe is expected to follow soon. What is the COAI stand on this? What are you asking the Indian government to do the same?
Obviously, spectrum bands and is under consideration. The 6 gigahertz spectrum bands is being considered. So the government of India has to make a call in terms of whether it wants to de-license that part of the spectrum or not. The position of the operators are saying is that, look, all we want is a level playing field. Obviously, de-licensed spectrum happens to take place in Wi-Fi. And 6 gigahertz is really an extension of Wi-Fi, just giving additional bandwidth that's available to be able to meet the demand for Wi-Fi type applications. Our point is that as long as we can maintain the level playing field issue, we don't have a problem, right? So, for example,
In that sense, do you have a problem with Wi-Fi?
No, so here's the point we made. So we said we don't have a problem with Wi-Fi, but we do have a problem with Wi-Fi being offered for commercial service purposes. Wi-Fi was always intended for private use, not for resale and make money of it. If you enter into that realm, then we are saying is that you create an unlevel playing field because one, you've got free spectrum, and now you're competing against a licensed person who had to pay for spectrum, access spectrum. So our only point is that if you're going to use 6 gigahertz spectrum, don't use de-licensed spectrum, and so you can come in and compete on the service side using free spectrum. You've got to create.
But doesn't the counterpoint to that is that you can compete in the same space as well? And to that sense, doesn't the license for telecom operators give them an advantage and an exclusivity, whereas over here it's an open playing field in Wi-Fi?
No, so because just guess what? If you earn revenue, you don't pay license fee and spectrum usage charge. We have to. For every rupee that I earn by selling Wi-Fi, right, I have to pay 15%. Use base quad. How can I compete?
Okay, fair enough. Rajan, I'm going to move on to some public policy questions. An anonymous user has asked this question, saying that Jammu and Kashmir has been deprived of high-speed spectrum since the last year, and especially in the times of the pandemic. What is your view on enabling 4G in Jammu and Kashmir?
So, this is before the Supreme Court, as you well know. It'll be, I have to be careful. Obviously, the court will decide upon this.
You're not a party in the case, so you don't have to be careful.
Okay. You're the lawyer, Nikhil. So,
I'm not, but I can.
So our point of view, we've always supported opening up, services in J&K. We've written to this. We're on record saying is that, look, yeah, obviously we have to defer to the government in terms of saying, look, if you see that there is a problem and for security purposes, we can't put ourselves into the shoes of the security agency in terms of determining, safety of life and limb and property. All right. So we always, and as per our license, we are obligated to. But we have made it known that, we would love to be able to remove the restrictions and allow people to enjoy the full. Because remember, it may be a bit selfish at this point, but we lose a lot of revenue, right?
So Rajan, to that end, if I may ask, why aren't you a party in that case? Since you lose a lot of revenue and since you want to open up services, why aren't you a party in that case that's asking, along with many others who are asking for opening up a 4G in J&K?
So I believe it's a PIL, right? That was filed, if I recollect correctly, right? So the PL,
yes.
Is fine as to whether, one, why are we not a party? I don't know the answer to that, Nikhil. Usually what happens is that with consensus in terms of everybody saying, let's do this and let's just go together. It's just the logistics of it. If somebody is going to do it, what added benefit is it for me to jump in and then have to, pay high-priced lawyers to go in and argue the case, right? So we're saying, look, if there's somebody already representing the case, we will let it go at that. But these are not easy things to litigate around, right?
No, I understand that completely. I'm just going back to the 66A and Section 79 cases, the famous Shreya Singhal case, where the Internet and Mobile Association of India actually was a party to that case and asked for intermediary liability protections to be strengthened because their industry demanded it. So does the telecom industry, your members not want to participate in some of these cases? Because we haven't seen the COAI really get involved in cases related to user rights in particular, like even with John Doe orders. I think Airtel in one instance was a party and pushed back against unilateral John Doe orders that were leading to the shutdown of websites. So, is there a particular reason why, in your opinion, the telecom operators or the industry body doesn't necessarily get involved in issues around blocking of sites? Internet shutdowns have impacted you more than any other industry in that sense, I would presume. So why is it that you don't take a legal approach to some of these challenges?
So I think initially, Nikhil, we've tried to work with the DOT on these matters because remember, under license conditions, the DOT is well within their rights to order us to do things. Right. Now, we would have to then go back and say is that, well, yes, we are obligated under our license conditions, but we think there's other reasons, either constitutionally or otherwise. It's, that's principally the one of the we tried our certain protocols, right? Very earlier on, with regard to the internet shutdown, we were saying that one, we're concerned that the protocols are not being faced, right, in terms of the orders. And two, we highlighted certain instances when the internet was shut down for what, in our opinion, was trivial reasons. And then as a result of that, orders were given from the DOT to the MHA. And our understanding is that the MHA then issued instructions to the district magistrates to say, look, here's the protocol before you try and shut down the internet. That's not your first option. And here's the stipulations or the criteria that you should look at before you invoke the shutting down. So I think there have been some improvements. So again, that's where we've traditionally kind of tried to deal with the issue, deal with the DOT. It's an order. It's part of our license conditions. You have to comply. Whether, a court going to court would materially change a license condition, right, is difficult at that point to parse.
No, that's a fair point, but there are also other instances like John Doe orders that have led to the shutting down of or the blocking of sites, whether it is, I mean, there was one time in Google Docs, for example, was inaccessible because of a John Doe order which Star India got related to the FIFA World Cup in 2014 that led to a huge outcry. There have been cases for example, banning of pornography. So we haven't seen much participation. I just wanted to flag that it does affect telecom operators from a business perspective. It affects users from their access rights perspective. Do you view the access to the internet as a fundamental right as an industry, Rajan?
So we have always said that access to the internet is absolutely essential for the exercise of your fundamental rights. Whether the internet access itself is a fundamental right, I don't think has been adjudicated as such, right? The fact that, the internet as a means to exercise your fundamental right to free expression, I think is basically my understanding of the courts, right? So yeah, we believe that. And so we have always tried to make sure that, access to the internet and, ability to connect to the internet and all of those are part and parcel of the things that a consumer enjoys. And that's why data networks have become the predominant networks that are now being invested in and that we continue to push for. So I don't think there's any hesitation. And also remember, Nikhil, even the protocols, most of our networks today are IP5, what we call IP5. So the fact that the IP protocol is part of our core and slowly spreading into our radio access part of the network and the backhaul parts of our network indicates that we're very keen to make sure that it's fairly seamless at some point, right? And increasingly, that's what is happening, right? As we move over to principally data-oriented networks, internet protocol becomes the dominant protocol. And so these fine lines of distinction almost disappear after a while.
And, so go ahead, Alan.
Yeah. So, Mr. Mathews, you have asked for app-enabled KYC through the Apex Committee on Telecom. So, is the government receptive to this, considering now that the lockdown has been extended twice and subscriber growth has gone to almost zero? Is that something that the DOT is considering allowing?
The DOT has been very supportive in terms of our submission. They said, look, clearly one of their critical concerns is working with the MHA, because every time KYC happens or any modification happens, it has to be done in concert with the MHA, because this is principally a security issue, right? The principal elements of what is recorded, right? So in our submission, one of the things that came up as problematic was physical delivery of the SIM. All right. So we realized that in a quarantine period, that might not be a very feasible thing. So we kind of said, okay, fine. We're probably best time to consider when those types of restrictions are lifted. Now, when those restrictions get lifted, we have suggested some ways that we can do things online. Obviously, if you're online, you have to have a data connection, right? And you have access to the internet and that type of thing. What the point we're raising is that we need to have the MHA. For example, let me just say this. Give you a document. You are not going to a retail location of ours, right? You're coming, you're sitting in front of a PC, or if you have a camera, one of the things that you have to do is you have to give us documents for proof of identity and proof of address. Now, what you can do is hold that document up in front of your camera and take a shot and then say, okay, fine, this is what I'm submitting, all right? Now, what about the authenticity of that document? How do I ensure that it's there? And then secondly, when you take a photograph, right, how do I know it's you and that that photograph hasn't been, somehow doctored with the wrong face or whatever, right? So there are considerations that we have to show to the MHA that those types of sort of concerns are adequately addressed vis-a-vis the type of things that we are putting in place to check for this. So for example, when somebody comes in front of the camera, we say, wave your hand, blink your eyes, do these types of things to ensure that you are who you are, right? So these types of things have to be then socialized with the MHA. They take a look holistically and then they have to give permission. This is where it is presently. Both the DOT and MHA are reviewing some of these recommendations of ours, and hopefully post the lockdown and quarantine, we can take that forward.
Absolutely. And on a related note to the lack of new subscribers, you have probably seen an increase in traffic, like you mentioned before, but has that also been accompanied by an increase in ARPU in this quarter?
I think we will expect to see some increase in the average revenue per user because a couple of things happened. Around one is obviously tariffs kicked in, and it takes about 2 to 3 months for tariffs to kind of roll through the network because there's old legacy, price points and plans which are valid for 30 days or 28 days or whatever. So it takes a while for this thing to move through the python, as they say. So I think in the first quarter of this year, beginning April, we should begin to see the benefits of some of that taking place. Secondly, we should see the benefits of the increased usage that kicked in as a result of the quarantine, people working from home. So the combination of those factors, I think, should lead to some type of an increase in the average revenue per user. So we'll hopefully wait and see how that pans out in the next couple of months.
Absolutely. And just a little bit of a broad question, if you'll excuse me, is that on KYC, to what extent have you seen the national security goals with which KYC was introduced for the telecom sector actually be accomplished? Because there have been countries where SIM registrations and similar KYC steps have been tested and then later withdrawn, like in Mexico. According to you as an industry body, would you say that these requirements, these regulations have been successful in their objective?
I don't know. Nothing is, absolutely, fail safe, right? Unfortunately, we do deal with counterfeit documents. We do deal with rogue points of sale. There have been instances when that has happened. We try our best to ensure that, we go after these people, get the rotten apples out of the basket. But that's an ongoing battle, right? But I would say, in most of our cases, and the term cells, which is an arm of the DoT, does audits every month. We are required to submit 10% of these activated accounts, and they go through it and make sure that it's complied with, that the person is real, that the addresses are real and bona fide and all of that. And we've seen an increasingly high, almost in the 90s plus compliance, right? So clearly, it does have a benefit. Is it 100% fail proof? Unfortunately, not. But one of the things that obviously is a challenge in India is identity. All right. And so that's why when Aadhaar came, the industry was rather keen at that point in time to say, look, it gets rid of a lot of ambiguity, checking, verification, because then your Aadhaar is verifiable online. And obviously it had challenges and it was tested in the courts. It has its, impacts, but we need something of that type of a nature that able to give us sort of better hit rates, if you will. But we do all kinds of things to make sure that you are who you say you are, and the documents that you submit to us are bona fide documents.
So, Rajan, just again changing track to policy. Many years ago, I remember the DoT had sent a letter to all telecom operators asking them to sharpen location sensitivity to about 100 meters to begin with, and then eventually to 50 meters, especially in states that were afflicted with violence because of the Naxals. So I wanted to check what's the status of that particular demand and what kind of location sensitivity exists for cell tower triangulation as of now.
Nikhil, you're right. What happened is that when that original order came several years ago, the industry pushed back rather heavily because, one, the ability to go to the level of precision that was asked for would have required a tremendous amount of investment from the...
I think it was about 1,500 crores according to Airtel at that point in time.
It was done through cell tower. Yeah, exactly, and counting, because these things, because the equipment. So you not only have to have the equipment, you have to actually install it on each cell tower. All right.
Yeah.
And the point that we were saying is that when you looked at other parts of the world that were looking at the same thing, it was principally driven through your GPS on your handset. And so we were saying is that, look, we ought to be able to look at that the
Rajan, I'm sorry,
multi-stack where these things are
I've
had
lost
its
you.
inherent limitations. As you,
I lost you for a bit there, Rajan, for most of this answer. I'm sorry. If you could just repeat.
yeah. So can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. Yes.
Yeah. So the point, what we were saying, Nikhil, was that in the order that was given there, it required us to install hardware and software on each cell tower to increase the efficiency in terms of the distances of error. All right. So, so this was a problem, and that was what you were referring to as a substantial investment. And plus, even with that, vertical location was a problem. Right. So, you know, the accuracy levels and ability to track on, if you're on the 23rd floor of a building, difficult. If again, if you were, you know, in interior of a basement or some such thing, I'd lose all contact with you, and it, you know, your last location in terms of where you last registered would be the point of reference, right? So the inherent problems were highlighted, and thankfully the DOT backed off. And what we also said is that we ought to also get the handset manufacturers involved in terms of saying, look, the rest of the world gives you much more accurate location and is more under the control of the user by using GPS on your handset. And also now realize, Nikhil, India has its own GPS tracking network. All right, they've got their own satellites, so you know, they have abilities to begin to do their own, if you will, triangulation or whatever. But as of today, to answer your question, it's principally driven off of location, off of the last cell tower you registered or are using at this particular point.
So is there sufficient sensitivity or sharpness available now?
So we give it in terms of the best parameters. So when the legal enforcement agency says we're interested in tracking so and so, so and so, we tell them, right, okay, based on the triangulation, the person is within X meters of this particular cell tower and this location, right? That's all we can sort of give them.
So why I'm asking this is because you know, the government, it seems, according to reports, has asked for, you know, for contact tracing purposes, cell tower data for individuals for tracing proximity and tracing location. And you know, we were wondering about how that plays out from a privacy perspective in terms of notice, consent, purpose limitation, some of the things that we've been discussing related to contact tracing. So what over there applies to telecom, or do you have do you inform users when their details are being shared with the government, when it's not for a law enforcement purpose, but it is for the purpose of you know, addressing issues related to the pandemic?
So, Nikhil, good point. We did raise this issue with the DOT because there were two letters we wrote when a certain amount of information was being asked of us from the operators, and the operators unanimously all together wrote and said, we are a bit concerned at the massive amounts of data you're asking for days and locations and vast geographies and areas. And the second time again, for this location specific type of information. And in both instances, the issue was, is the interest of the consumer being adequately protected vis-a-vis, you know, privacy and everything else. And as you recall, and was reported, the DOT came back very strongly and said, no, this is anonymized data. It's as per the Telegraph Act of 1885. It's as per your license conditions. We have the right to ask of this. And so it's under this paragraph and blah, blah. And so you're obligated to provide this. And so we said, look, the only assurance we want is that if, when we give it to you, that it does, you know, sort of be subject to the types of safeguards you're indicating, like you're saying it's anonymized, it does not track CDR, it does not track specifics and that type of thing, and it's used for the particular purposes that we are looking for. And the other adequacy that we asked for was that, please help us ensure that this does not, once it gets perhaps out of your use to some other third party, that they understand that this is confidential information that has been obtained as a result of your rights under the 1885 Act. So we have highlighted that, and assurances have been given to us by the DOT that they are putting in place the appropriate safeguards for privacy. So we have to take it at that right now.
Okay, so Rajan, just staying with privacy, what sort of changes would you like to see uh, in maybe your license conditions also from a lawful interception perspective? Like, given the demands that the telecom industry must be facing for data on their users, do you think that the current status or the current framework of seeking information is adequate, or do you think that there is scope for improving privacy for individuals within that? So, what improvements would you like to see?
I think, Nikhil, in general, the protocol, which basically says, it has to have a certain protocol of, starting from the Home Secretary and down to the local levels, who's authorized to give you an order and where that
Hmm.
order comes from. So one of the things that we would like to see strengthened is that whole protocol, because when things are hot, you'll find some lower person and you're given 24 hours to make sure that it goes back up the command chain and gets the appropriate signature of the Home Secretary of the state and the Home Secretary of the center. Sometimes within 24 hours, it becomes an A. It's done, it's finished. And so we'd just like to make sure that the protocol that is adhered to, agreed, which we think is a good protocol and an appropriate protocol, is there. There is judicial review, as you know, right? Things can be brought before, the appropriate judicial review in terms of these being questioned. That is in place. So I think those are
But
adequate. Yeah, go
but
ahead.
Rajan, there are something like, from what I remember, about 300 orders per day that are given for interception. How many of those actually make it to a judge or for judicial review?
We see, Nikhil, so here's what a license requires. Our license requires real time. The only time we get involved otherwise, then tell the legal enforcement agency, oh, let us,
Sorry, Rajan, I've lost you there again. I think there might be a connectivity issue. Could you please repeat your answer? There seems to
yeah,
be a
can you hear me
connectivity. Yes,
now?
yes.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so the point I was making, Nikhil, was that increasingly we've automated the process. And what I
Hmm.
mean by that is that while the protocol for permissions and requests is still pretty much, paper oriented and all of that, and that's appropriate, the actual enforcement of those orders are now in terms of a central monitoring system, CMS, is being
Right.
started by the government. And so all we're obligated to do is provide connectivity from our network to the CMS station. So
Hmm.
we don't get involved in de-encrypting files or anything of the sort. All right. And so they are now directly involved in this. The only time that we additionally are asked is if what we call a CDR, call detail record, which has
Yes.
information about various aspects of the call at any particular point in time. If that is asked for, then what we do is that we download it from our networks and give them. And if KYC information, obviously, if somebody is a person of interest,
Hmm.
giving them the data of the person's identity and address, those types of things are provided. But the rest of the time, as I said, to your point, Nikhil, it's really pretty transparent to the operator because they are directly connected. They are listening in or observing or tracking the traffic real time, and they do
Right.
whatever they want with it. So we don't inject ourselves in that
Right.
stream.
So this does the centralized monitoring system also allow tracking of internet access data?
I mean, yes, they do, because obviously, at some point, right, it either is in process on our networks or it
Hmm.
is in storage on our networks at some point, right? So the
Hmm.
question becomes is that if you try and access it, the problem is that most of that traffic is highly encrypted.
Hmm.
All right. So the challenge invariably for legal enforcement, and this is, as you well know, the context of a lot of the back and forth, is the encryption levels that some of these applications use
Hmm.
while transmitting data or even perhaps when storing the data.
And understood. So, Rajan, there's a question from Rahul Sharma who's asked about whether India should go for satellite plus tower 5G.
We've always said that we're open to all aspects of it. The problem with satellite is, one, it's a monopoly with the government. It hasn't been opened up. And two, satellite prices from last I understood was 7 times the global average. So it has not become economically feasible to begin to start using satellite technology, although it is useful, right? It can't compete right now against terrestrial types of services. All right. So yes, I think, as you know, the government has 100%. They own all the satellites. They own the bandwidth. And so if you are a private operator that needs to, you have to go to them. And the pricing is obviously always not very favorable vis-a-vis international pricing points. So there are some inherent friction points, which I think need to be addressed if this is going to become a viable proposition for use in India.
And
Okay.
yep. So
No, go ahead, Arun.
yeah. So Mr. Mathews, just a small question on net neutrality. Now that it's been around 4 years, 3 to 4 years, depending on which regulation you're looking at, for that net neutrality has become a part of the license conditions. So what do you think of the relevance of differential data tariffs in the market we are in right now, with tariffs for data so low up amongst the world? And do you think it even makes business sense as a offering to have differential data pricing in any scenario?
Yeah, so Arun, I think we may have a bit of a bandwidth issue here. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Two different questions in my mind, Arun. One is network neutrality. Absolutely, all our operators agree and support.
Sorry, we're losing you there again, Rajan. There seems to be a connectivity problem.
By the
Mr. Mathews, I'm not sure. I don't think we can hear you. Can you just repeat that answer?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Yeah,
I can hear you now. Can you just repeat the answer from the beginning?
Yeah, is that we
we can't. We lost you again, Rajan. If only we had higher bandwidth. If only we had higher bandwidth allocation for video streaming services. I'm just kidding. I don't support that.
But can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm saying is that our operators subscribe 100% to the fact of net neutrality. It is now enshrined in our license conditions, so there's really no choice. The only discussion right now going on net neutrality is network management. So TRAI has asked for some clarity as to disclosures around when operators manage the network and what should be the disclosure element. So that's the only thing on net neutrality. Now, differential pricing, is something we kind of stay away from tariff issues, Arun. Obviously, that's going to land us in the soup if we start poking around our tariffs. So, we'd rather not get into that. I think, one thing I can say, you have the most affordable tariffs. I don't think any consumer today is complaining about affordability. So I think I'll leave it at that.
So one last question, Rajan. Thank you for joining us. It's been a long discussion, but a slightly political question maybe. What do you think of the Facebook Reliance deal?
This is my personal response, Nikhil. It's not a COAI response. So let me take off my COAI hat and kind of talk from my own perspective. I've always been saying that when we look at the future of our networks, all of our networks are converging to data networks. This differentiation between a voice network and a data network is fast becoming obsolete. All right. And as we move over to 5G, those distinctions become increasingly irrelevant, right? So I have to ask ourselves if the future is, cloud computing, and we're talking about edge computing and all of this, you'll notice that it's all computing, right? Which is data, right? So I've always said that the future of our networks will tend towards, all type of a data environment, even in the radio access part of our network, although we use spectrum that will continue, obviously, for mobility purposes. But by and large, it's all going to be reduced to zeros and ones. So in that sense, it's digitalized. All right. So what my perspective has always been that, yes, who are the people today who run the largest data networks? All right. It's your Amazons and your Facebooks and your Googles and everybody else. They have a tremendous amount of expertise in running, managing data networks. So again, my personal point of view is that at some point, it makes a lot of sense to synergize between what we today call our data voice networks and all these data networks, because when data flows, these kind of artificial distinctions increasingly become obsolete and sometimes are interesting. Just look at our present networks, right? You have to have a translation mechanism, right? Which is why we had to go IP, right? When something comes over the internet, it comes into our core, then you got to translate it because there's a voice component, but now it has to get retranslated at the other end. So there's all of these friction points, and increasingly, my point is that as we go forward, I think that this unlocks more value for our operators in the long term. Is my personal opinion, not necessarily a COI opinion, by the way.
So just on that personal opinion bit, there have been concerns raised from a competition perspective, saying that the most dominant app in the country is WhatsApp with 400 million users. The most dominant social network in the world is Facebook, and the most dominant mobile operator with the highest number of internet users is Reliance Jio. So, do you have competition concerns as well?
So I think, Nikhil, Geo themselves have said that they look forward to Competition Commission taking a look at this, right? They themselves have raised the issue. So to your question, yes, I think they've asked for the CCI, and I believe that it is part of the report.
No, but from your personal perspective, do you think there's cause for concern from a telecom operator environment perspective, where you have operators competing with each other, and there's two the largest operators that's essentially partners with the largest data network, as you called it?
Nikhil, very well, I mean, size in and of itself is not a determinant of anti-competitive behavior, right? So it's like actually what happens in terms of the exercise of dominant market share. So the question that you're raising is that, one, does this amount to, a dominant market? And then is it predatory in nature in terms of anything that happens, right? So I think those would be the critical factors that the Competition Commission is going to look at. So again, from a personal perspective, right, the last time this matter went to the Supreme Court said that the Competition Commission needs to define these terms, right, and that it is not TRAI's ambit to define these terms, which is what TRAI tried to do previously, right, when we had to go to the court. So I don't know that has been completely done by the Competition Commission of India, certainly in terms of saying is that, in this, what is relevant market, what is, dominant market share mean, what is therefore predatory pricing involved in these dynamics when you're talking about data. We are kind of into a different realm, right, when we talk about these. So again, from my personal perspective, I think the ball, the ball is in the right court. The Competition Commission needs to take a look at this, as Geo themselves have indicated, and hopefully, they will answer the types of questions that you raised.
Great. Thank you very much for joining us, Rajan. I'm just going to end this by a small anecdote. I think it was 2011. I was on an Idea Cellular earnings conference call, and I got an opportunity to ask Sanjeev Aga about internet usage. I think 2009 or 2011. And he said, we don't track this information. It's not important, or it's not large enough for us to consider. And here we are, a little close to a decade later. And I guess terrestrial networks and analog networks are history, and all we're talking about is data and the internet. So,
let me give you another anecdote, if I will. This is 1983. Judge Green antitrust action against
sorry, we've lost you again there, Rajan. You'll have to repeat your anecdote.
The issue was, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Which network are you on, Rajan?
I'm on unfortunately, I use a local Wi-Fi here, and that's probably part of the problem.
I must tell you, I'm on a mobile operator network, and they're much more reliable than wireline in India today.
So I'm raising was hearing. Yeah, can you hear me?
Loud and clear now.
Yeah. So Judge Green, 1983, was hearing the antitrust case of AT&T, right, to dismember this, and AT&T Bell Labs had just brought out mobility, right? They discovered how cellular networks work, and they had the proprietary information. Judge Green asked AT&T, says, all right, what do you want to do with this license? Judge Green and AT&T then hired one of the preeminent consulting firms. I won't tell you which one. All right. They went and did an analysis to find out what the value of this mobile license would be to AT&T. This consulting firm, world famous consulting firm, came back and said, there will never be more than 1 million customers who will use this service. You know what AT&T did? They told Judge Green, please give it to the baby bells that are emerging. 15, 20 years later, they came back and brought a mobility company, AT&T Wireless. So, anecdotes.
Great, Rajan. On that note, here's to more mobility and more internet users.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you very much for joining
Thank
us.
you, Nikhil. Thank you, Arun. I appreciate this opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.